So, what I'd like to finish with are some considerations about how we can develop the right human dog relationship. And what I mean by the right human dog relationship is, I mean right for both the human, but also for the dog. In simple terms, we become what we present ourselves as. So, if we behave in a certain way, then the dog will accept us in that particular role. If we are inconsistent, then the dog will accept those inconsistencies. That will be quite stressful for the dog, and also it may encourage the dog to take on certain roles that we may or may not want it to do so, and that can be problematic if we don't want that. An important thing to appreciate, though, is the difference between relationships and bonds, and I just want to touch on this first. So, relationships are sustained associations between two or more individuals, characterized by behavior occurring within it and its duration. So we describe a relationship because we see certain patterns of behavior. Relationships change over time. They can change with age, etc. We can form relationships, we can break up relationships. But as I said, a true relationship should be sustained for at least some notable time. A fleeting encounter, we don't consider that those two animals have much of a relationship in that situation. Relationships can be purely functional, in so much as two individuals come together in order to achieve a certain goal. That would be a functional relationship. They can do something together that they can't do alone. However, relationships can also be emotional. What I mean by that is that you come together because perhaps that helps to reduce stress. There is a growing body of evidence to suggest that things like social support can be very important to help animals cope with stress and recover from it. So by having friends, etc., then one of the benefits of that is the emotional relationship. So the emotions can not only form the basis of the relationship, but they can be a very important part of it as well. The bonds are the glue of a relationship. They are the reason why the relationship exists. There are affectionate bonds, and these have to be compatible between two individuals for the relationship to work, for there to be an effective bond. That does not mean it has to be the same. So you might think that the bond between friends, yes, that is much more reciprocal. You expect for friendship to work that you are equally fond of each other. However, the bond between a mother and an infant is very different than the bond between the infant and the mother. In that situation, the bond of the mother towards the infant is very much about the satisfaction that comes from caring for that individual. The bond between the infant and the mother, which is often called an attachment bond, comes from the benefits of being provided with those resources and safety and security, and it is a very strong bond because it is what keeps the infant safe. These are all examples of affectionate bonds. Affiliations are bonds where you come together because it works. It's an alliance, if you like. You will see affiliations within functional relationships. But there is a third type of bond that we need to be aware of, and this is the service bond. This is where some things individuals are kept together because that one is useful to the other. In this situation, one is in a position of power over the other, and their primary focus is on the value of the other individual to perform perhaps a particular job. When we talk about service dogs, there is a service relationship. A working dog is only valuable for as long as it is working in that respect. However, I hope you'll appreciate that just because it is a service dog, that doesn't mean there can't also be affiliations, but also affectionate bonds as well. So it's not a question of these being exclusive. The relationship may feature a bond with both affectionate characteristics, affiliative characteristics, and also an element of service as well. When we think about love, then we're thinking about the bond. When we think about what individuals do with each other, then we're thinking about their relationships. One of the important features of a social relationship is that there is some form of shared common interest, whether that be between friends, or whether that would be between parents and offspring, or between two parents. And one of the features of working together within a social group is you can't have necessarily everything that you want when you want it. You have to make compromises in order to be able to operate, because unless your desires and needs totally synchronize with the other individual, there's the potential for conflict. This is what I mean by the social contract. If we're involved in a social relationship, then we recognize that actually there is another individual who has interests in that relationship, and that we have to occasionally compromise. What is important in the dog owner and owner-dog relationship is that that social contract is clearly indicated by our behavior. If we're not clear as to who gets what and when, then that can cause tension. That can be stressful for the owner, and is certainly stressful for the dog. It's okay to allow your dog to do certain things, as long as you're consistent in allowing it to do that. It's fine to have the dog on the sofa if that's what you want, but you shouldn't then suddenly change the rules without preparing the dog for that change in the rules. Inevitably, and as I said, because our needs and wants don't entirely match up with other individuals, there will be conflicts of interest from time to time, but that doesn't mean that we have to come to physical blows. It doesn't have to be resolved through aggression. We need to think carefully about where those conflicts are or potentially will occur, and ensure that we have clear sets of rules to follow. When there are conflicts of interest between individuals, I would argue that it is morally important that we give careful consideration to all who might be significantly affected by our decisions, and that in the case of the dog-owner relationship includes the dog. The dog does have interest in the outcome, even if it can't express things in a complex moral framework. It has interest. It is affected by our actions in the same way a very young child is affected by our actions, and we have to think about what their needs are. So in order to build healthy relationships, we need to think carefully, what are the roles of ourselves and our dogs in that relationship? What do we want them to be? And how do we let the dog know that this is what we want? How do we build these expectations, and how do we maintain them? And if we just take a few minutes to think about that, and you might want to reflect upon your own relationship with your own dog and think about, what are the roles and how do you communicate that? How clear is it? If it's not clear, then the chances are there will be some tension within the relationship from time to time. We can prevent that tension by a little bit of forethought, because we're the ones with the brains that can think into the future. If we think about the emotional side of the relationship and the emotional bond that exists, think about the feelings that you have towards your dog, and how you actually show that. It's important to stop and think about how you show it, and whether or not, just because you show your love in a way that makes sense to you, does it make sense to the dog? As humans, we tend to show friendliness by greeting people face on face, chest on chest. We might give them a hug. This is not how dogs greet each other, though. And if we do that in a very human way, for some dogs that can be problematic. It can be seen as very intimidating, a hard stare, especially if they don't know you very well. So we might want to express our feelings of love by throwing our arms around the dog and running up to it. But to a dog, that could be a very threatening gesture. Shouldn't be surprised if they respond by showing their aversion to that. Now, it doesn't mean we can't perhaps train dogs to accept that situation, but we shouldn't expect it to happen immediately. By the same measure, we want to think, how would we like our dogs to feel about us? And how do we want the dog to show this? We can encourage those behaviors, but equally we have to think carefully about how we respond when the dog doesn't reciprocate as we like. Of course, it's disappointing, but by getting angry, we're not going to help the situation. We're not going to get the dog to love us even more by upsetting the dog in that situation. So we need to think about how we show our affection. We spend more time understanding dogs, looking at how dogs interact. Gently stroking dogs is a little bit like dogs licking each other. That's why stroking the dog in certain areas can be a good way of bonding with your dog. It's a way that the dog understands, and actually, people find it enjoyable. Patting the dog on the head, less likely to be enjoyed by the dog in many situations. So there are ways that we can show our affection for the dog that we both enjoy, but also the dog does as well. Most owners, they want to care for their dog and meet their dog's needs. And there is, as I said at the beginning of this talk, a legal obligation in some countries to do that. If we think about the needs of the dog, most owners will provide for those physiological needs by providing a healthy diet and good health care. But there are other needs. There are safety needs, the need for protection and to have some control over the environment, and by having consistency, that also breeds a sense of safety. We also have social needs, feeling that we belong as a valuable member of the group. We have other psychological needs associated with a sense of achievement and success. And finally, we have needs in fulfilling our potential. We feel good when we succeed at the things that we find quite hard. Now, whilst perhaps these latter needs in humans are very much the product of us sort of forming models of what we want to achieve, they can be represented in a dog-centric way as well. And originally, this hierarchy of needs was presented in the social sciences by Haslow. And many years ago, I suggested that this can be applied to dogs. The interesting thing about this hierarchy is that as one set of needs are met, so other needs become important. So, safety and security only become important if you know that you've got a ready access to food and drink. If you don't, then you may have to take risks to get those. Now, we'd like to think that most owners meet those basic physiological needs or control them effectively in their dogs. So, for example, reproduction may not be allowed, but the dog may be neutered in that situation. If that's the situation, then actually the next most important thing for the dog becomes security. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that. If the dog feels safe and secure, then actually the opportunities for building a healthy relationship and a strong social bond between you and your dog is greatly increased. And as a result of that, you may then find that the dog does things in order to please you. That's perhaps moving us towards the human equivalent of those psychological needs. And as a result of that, then the full potential of your relationship with your dog and your dog's full potential can be achieved. And that's the equivalent perhaps to the human self-actualization. The individual is achieving its potential. Let's turn our attention to the second level of needs here. Assuming that the owners are providing food and drink, we need to make sure that they provide the safety needs of the dog. There are two broad forms of safety that are talked about in relation to attachment theory. One is the safe haven and the other is the secure base. A safe haven is a place you go to for comfort and support when you feel threatened. It is not the same as a place you go to hoping that you will feel safe. It is a place where you can actually relax. So the dog that runs under the stairs or into a cupboard when it hears a bang and trembles is not running to a safe haven because it is not actually relaxing. In a safe haven, you know that you are going to be safe. It's the place you go to when you are stressed. A secure base is a place that you use as a reference point in order to explore perhaps more challenging situations. It's a reliable foundation for exploring the novelty of the environment. Now, in the case of the owner, I would argue that a healthy relationship depends on the owner being both a safe haven and a secure base. It doesn't mean there aren't safe havens and secure bases elsewhere, and I would suggest that every dog should have a physical safe haven within its home, a place where it can go where it knows that it will be safe and secure, because if you've got visitors, then the dog perhaps will need to be able to relax because they might show some unexpected patterns of behavior. A safe haven is quite easy to build in the home. You have a designated area that is clearly demarcated, or you could use something like a crate, as long as you leave the door open. There are a number of simple rules. When the dog is in the safe haven, the dog is in control, so that you must never close or lock the gate if you're going to make it into a safe haven. You can just use a simple mat that demarcates it, and the beauty of a mat is that you can take it from one area to another. So the first rule is the dog is in control in that situation. So that also means that if you want to take the dog for a walk, you can ask the dog if it wants to go for a walk if it's on its safe haven, but you should not go up to it and put the lead on, because if you do that, you remove its autonomy, its ability to control the situation. If the dog stays on its mat or in its safe haven when you say walkies, then you should respect that decision and go for the walk without the dog. Enjoy the fact that you've managed to read your dog effectively and it indicated it didn't want to go for a walk. You mustn't impose yourself on the dog. You can provide nice things for the dog in that situation, but the dog has the choice. No harm must happen to the dog when it is in that environment. So you must make sure that things can't fall on the dog or the dog be harmed in any way. So if somebody can't understand the rules of a safe haven, they should not be left alone with the dog in that situation. Owners can often understand this concept quite well, and they can also develop the safe haven within the home at a time when they're not emotionally distressed. Having a safe haven can play an enormous role in helping dogs to cope with all sorts of stresses in the home, from unexpected visitors to fireworks and thunderstorms outside. If the dog knows that there is no harm going to happen to it, then it will take itself to the safe haven and it will relax and even sleep in that situation. I suggest that every dog has a safe haven in its home. But if we return now to the dog-owner relationship, then the dog should also be able to use the owner as a safe haven. If I'm with you, then no harm will happen to me. By saying that, it should be quite clear that in order to be a safe haven, you cannot be engaging in physical punishment with your dog. It is just not compatible with you being seen as a safe haven. So this is a strong argument for why we shouldn't use physical punishment. Owners should also act as a secure base, a focus for which the dog can explore uncertain environments. And in this situation, they will take a lot of cues from the owner. If a dog is uncertain, it may turn to the owner. Now, the temptation for many owners is to try and console the dog and say, look, it's okay, everything's all right. Unfortunately, the body language that we use in that situation can actually communicate to the dog that we might be worried as well. That doesn't help the dog. If a dog turns to us when it is uncertain, we look at it and we say, okay, everything's all right, and then act much more confidently as we walk into the environment and show there is nothing to be afraid of, the dog is much more likely to respond in a positive way. That's what it means to act as a secure base, but it depends on you also fulfilling the role of a safe haven. In this slide, I show the results of a study done by the Hungarian group, looking at reactive and non-reactive dogs. Reactive dogs are the darker grey bars, and I want to focus on those. The y-axis on this graph indicates the heart rate of the dogs. What you can see is that when the owner is present, the grey bar rises up. That's the middle bar on each of the two graphs. However, when the owner is absent, the heart rate goes up a lot more. So the presence of the owner reduces the reactivity, even in the reactive dogs. If you look at the dogs that are not reactive, then in the presence of the owner, there is no change in the heart rate. However, in their absence, there is an increase in heart rate to the threat. So, owners can act as a safe base for owners when they are threatened. This has important physiological effects for the dog. So, interestingly, they also found that if the dog encountered the threat with the owner first, then that had a carryover effect for when the owner wasn't there. Again, that's an important finding. So if the dog has a good relationship with you and encounters something stressful, the dog will react less. Later on, if the dog is on its own and it encounters something similarly threatening, actually it will again be able to cope that much better. This is a powerful reason for why we need to develop healthy relationships with dogs. I hope it's clear now that using physical punishment with dogs is just not compatible with developing these sorts of healthy relationships. There's also a moral argument against it as well, because physical punishment is associated with compelling animals to do things we want. It reduces the animal's autonomy, ability to operate on its own. That in itself is a moral concern. Even if it doesn't have long-term effects, and I'm not saying that every form of physical punishment will have long-term effects, it certainly reduces well-being in the short term. And again, that's an ethical issue because it has to make things unpleasant in order to build the necessary association. It's far more efficient to focus on what you actually want. If there are humane alternatives, I would also say the use of physical punishments transgresses another important moral concern, the one of fairness. Why use something that causes suffering when there are better alternatives? But that depends on there being better alternatives. And as I've said, using physical punishment really doesn't produce the type of relationship most owners want. And indeed, if you use physical punishment, then the relationship between the dog and the owner can cease to be an enriched and powerful, strong, emotional, loving relationship, and perhaps becomes one where the value of the dog is purely focused on what the dog does as opposed to the joy that the dog brings. An area of some debate is the use of shock collars for livestock worrying. Some people have claimed that shock collars can be used in the case of livestock worrying because there is no alternative. There's been a lot of criticism of shock collars because of the welfare concerns, but that doesn't address the issue of whether or not there are humane alternatives. And that question has remained unanswered until recently. And in the next slide, I'm going to present the results of some work that we did and we recently published, which actually shows that shock collars are not necessary and that you can achieve as far as we can tell, good recalls around livestock with the use of positive reinforcement without the use of shock collars. In this study, we had actually two populations of trainers and 3 conditions. One population of trainers sometimes used shock collars and sometimes didn't. They provide the data for the e-collar group and control group 1 on this slide. The second group of trainers never used shock collars and were always focused on the provision of positive reinforcement in their training. If we look at the table at the top, what we see is that with the e-collar group is that for both the come and the sit command, that the dogs learn the response, but actually their response is slower than when the training is focused on positive reinforcement. That's the control group B. In the case of the come command, the control group 1, their responses are somewhere in between the e-collar group and the group that tend to focus on positive reinforcement. So whilst all the groups managed to train the come and the sit command, the speed of response, i.e. the delay between the command and the animal responding, was best in the group that focused on positive reinforcement. If we now turn our attention to the graphs beneath the table, then we actually see a big difference between the two populations of trainers. What is clear is that the trainers who focus on the use of positive reinforcement use far fewer hand signals and far less use of the lead in order to achieve the successes. So they look to reward the dog when the dog is doing the right thing. They don't guide the dog into those behaviors. The people who use e-collars in this situation, whether or not they're using e-collars, they use a lot of hand signals, and they also use a lot of tension on the lead to control the dog. So this work suggests that not only are there differences in the efficacy of the techniques, but actually the trainers themselves may have a very different culture. That is an important point, that people who sometimes use physical punishment may actually have a different style of training altogether. But when they don't use that collar, they still have that style of training, and it may be less effective perhaps than people who are committed to only using positive reinforcement in order to try and build the behaviors that they want. Just before I finish, I want to talk a little bit about the other form of punishment. The use of an electric shock is what's known as positive punishment. The other form of punishment is negative punishment. And negative punishment happens when you don't get an expected reward and you use it in order to stop a certain behavior. Negative punishment underpins certain behavior modification programs like the Nothing in Life is Free or NILIF program, which is popularly used by people. And again, people sometimes think, well, this is sort of how dogs operate. You can use it to assert dominance by controlling resources in a non-violent way. However, as we've seen, dogs don't monopolize resources, and so this is perhaps not appropriate. As I've already mentioned, dogs are sensitive to reward inequity. If one person seems to control all the resources and not share them when they're needed effectively, then actually that can damage the relationship and result in less cooperations. A concern with the Nothing in Life is Free programs is they remove the animal's sense of control over the environment. And if you feel that you have no control over the environment, then that is a very good setup for developing depression or learned helplessness. Now, just because the dog gives up on responding, that doesn't mean the dog is well behaved and happy. So in some of these situations, the dog's behavior might change towards what superficially looks desirable, but actually from the point of view of the animal's well-being may actually be far more problematic, because it could be that the animal is actually much more depressed and that's why it's not playing up. What we need to do is set clear boundaries. There's a wonderful book by Kathy Sadeo called Plenty in Life is Free. It is fine to give your dog rewards for just being your dog. But what is important is that we set clear boundaries. This is what I want from you. And we can do that by using rewards and the judicial withholding of rewards in certain situations in order to teach those boundaries. We don't have to use physical force in order to assert those boundaries. And we don't have to deprive the dog of everything as advocated in the nothing in life is free type of setup. But we can carefully use withholding rewards in order to teach dogs what those boundaries are and build a very loving relationship in those situations. So, in conclusion, the dog-human relationship is a very emotional relationship, but the content of that emotion depends on the quality of the interactions experienced. Just loving the dog doesn't mean necessarily that the dog will love us in return, and that's an important thing to appreciate. We need to set things up by following these principles, letting the dog know that it's valued as a member of our social group, and communicating our affection for it in ways that the dog can understand. A healthy relationship depends on individuals understanding their role within it through consistent interaction, and that means the way we do things as well as what we actually do. And by focusing on rewarding the things that we want rather than trying to enforce roles. If we reward what we want, we will get more of that, and we will get, as a result, not only a dog that loves us, but also a very well-behaved dog. Providing leadership doesn't require physical punishment or assertion of status, but rather supportive encouragement to build those affectionate bonds. If we have that strong relationship with our dogs, then our dogs will naturally follow our leadership in those situations and make good decisions as a result. And that in itself will make the relationship stronger still. Humans are naturally very power focused in the way we think about things. It's about controlling in that situations. That is not how dogs operate. And indeed, over the many years that I've been working with dogs and researching dogs' minds, one thing has become very clear to me, that dogs work very hard to fit in with us. They are trying to make things work. What we have to do is set things up so that they can see what the rules are, and then both they and we can be happy in that situation. So we're the ones with the complex brains. We need to try to understand them rather than force them to comply. And that is what being a good companion animal behaviorist is all about. Trying to understand dogs better, cats better, and all the other species, and trying to set things up so that they do what we want in a way that makes them happy as well. Thank you very much.